All right, so here's the deal. Jeff, appreciate you jumping on. We've got Jeff
Sure.
Glover with me to discuss how to navigate what I'm calling the new deal structure post NAR settlement going into effect in late July, early August. And so, Jeff, you and I were talking off air about how we're navigating this, the what seems to be thousands of questions that come up all the time. What if this?
Yeah.
What if that? All these different things. And so, again, appreciate you coming on to try to help the real estate agent community really navigate this, because I think you said it best in your post on Facebook, which was agents are scared. They
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen. They don't know where to turn. And I wanted to have you on the show to really help bring some clarity. Nobody has a crystal ball, but
Yep.
you and I are thinking about this every single day. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So the way I think about this, I want to talk specifically on the listing side first, on a couple of ways that we can structure a potential listing taken
Hmm.
as we get ready to enter that into the marketplace. So, under the new circumstances around all of the new rules, which I'm assuming the audience, you guys are all aware of, how do you see that happening? Like, what do you think the new norm will be when you go to take a listing? How are you going to structure compensation?
Yeah. So, Brandon, there's a couple factors that we have to consider as listing agents. Number one, we have to consider how educated the seller is on the change. I think it's safe to say that, if you were to do a study or a survey, I think it's safe to say that the majority, I couldn't tell you whether it's 51% or 99%, the majority are aware of the changes because it made national media and people pay attention to the news. Now, I would probably also say the majority aren't clear on what the changes were. They just read a headline that says, you can now save money when you sell, or gone are the days of the 6% commission. So we have to kind of consider that as a listing agent, that the most sellers are aware of this change. We also have to factor in that um, a lot of listing agents, not all of them, but a lot of listing agents are not necessarily skilled. And so as you've seen in the market over the last few years, anyone could call themselves a listing agent, go out on an appointment and list any property at any price and be in fairly good shape. And so, if you take those couple things into consideration, because, sellers are doing business with family or friends or neighbors or just whoever has nothing to do with how skilled or experienced they are, then I think as listing agents, we have to be prepared. The skilled ones have to be prepared to compete against the somewhere between a 2 and 3% model that sellers are going to hear from listing agents when they go on appointments. They're going to hear things like, you're not, you never were forced to pay the buyer's agent. And today, it's becoming customary where you may or may not have to pay the buyer's agent. So you give the seller a little bit of that language to grab onto, plus what they've heard in the media, plus mix that in with a pretty hot seller's market. And I think it's going to be pretty normal for us to go on appointments where sellers are saying, well, yeah, but the last guy was at 2%, and he said I didn't have to pay anything out to the buyer's agent under this new rule. So why are you coming in here at blank when the last guy was at this number? I think that that's a reality of something we're going to deal with as listing agents pretty regularly.
Yeah, great point. And I think I agree with you 100%. I think that the first thing that we have to consider when we look at, okay, how am I going to structure my listing compensation is to your point that we're going to focus on collecting the listing fee, what it is that you charge.
Minimum fee on the listing side. That's right.
Yep. All right. So you and I, that's the context in which we're talking about first. That's the first scenario. You believe that the new norm is that listing agents go on an interview and they're only focused on having the conversation around listing fee commission.
I believe that there will be a lot of agents that might attempt to help sellers understand the value in offering a commission or concessions to attract buyers, but I don't believe that that's going to be the norm. So I think the focus will be mostly on, well, what do you charge to represent me as a listing agent?
Okay. Got it. All right. Makes sense. And so,
By the way,
because
I
yeah,
like that. I'm not
sure.
saying, I'm not saying I agree with that. I think it should be commission offered out on both sides, and I know we're
For
going to get to
sure.
that. But I just know how the average agent thinks when they get in a competitive situation And you've got a seller who's really tough that says, well, I was told you didn't have to pay that anymore. Now you've got someone with not a lot of skill that's going to have to turn around and convince that seller why they should pay it. And I just think most won't.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said in your address to, you put it out on YouTube the other last week. You said, I think you called them rounds. Like, I think you said in round one or like in phase one, like
the first iteration of it.
Yeah. First iteration, right? And so I want to talk about, okay.
First iteration, I do believe we will see sellers offering out just because it's been the norm for so long. But as time goes on, I see that slowly coming down.
100% agree. Okay.
Also market dependent, Brandon. All of a sudden we shift into a buyer's market. I mean, you remember the days, 2009, 2010, 2011, we were offering 3.5 or 4% to convince a buyer's agent to come show our listing. But it really is also market dependent, and that's kind of an unknown that nobody knows.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly right. I mean, another thing you said that I agree with 100% is if you look at every closed transaction over the last couple of years and you say how many of them offered a seller concession, it starts with 0.
Yeah. I was in Fairview Heights, Illinois yesterday, and because I've had a lot of people reaching out, and I'm sure you have as well, that want to kind of spar on this whole conversation. And by the way, I respect a great debate, so I welcome it. But I had somebody yesterday say, well, I was told that we're going to be okay because you can still offer commissions and concessions through other methods. You just can't put it in the MLS anymore. And I thought to myself, gosh, that is an agent that's sticking their head in the sand, because you're right. That is probably what half the industry is being told. And on the other side of it, the example I gave was, okay, think back to 2022, Brandon. All right, think about it. You're in your brokerage in 2022. How many deals got done where you saw seller concessions being offered? I mean, like less than 1%. Yes. Yeah. I actually asked the audience yesterday, show of hands, who had an offer accepted in 2022 with seller concessions? Not a single hand went up. So, this idea that all of the sudden it's just going to be no big deal. It'll just be seller concessions in the remarks in the MLS. You'll still get paid. I think those agents are in for a rude awakening, Brandon.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation, because you and I are aligned on that 100%. And so we're going to flip to the buy side in just a second. But
by the way, I want to make myself clear, because I know you get this too. I've had several local brokers in Detroit. How dare you take that stance, Jeff? Well, my first response is I'm just taking the truth. I'm just telling you the truth, first of all. Second of all, I didn't say I was going to go on listing appointments and not convince sellers and help sellers understand the value in paying concessions. I'm just talking about the average agent isn't going to have the skill level to convince sellers to do that every single time. So we 100%. We have to prepare for that being the norm, because the norm is average.
Yeah, I think what Jeff's saying, and for the audience sake, if you really hear what he just said, it isn't that you or I agree or think this one way or the other.
We don't want that.
That's right. We don't want that. But to your point, I think you just hit the nail on the head, which is, if you look at the vast majority of agents, they're going to take the path of least resistance. And what is that? That means to go into a listing appointment and charge the least amount possible to win the listing. Yep. That will become the norm. Yes. And so it's a constant uphill battle when that is the norm. That's what you're saying.
So you go in and you're competing with a listing, and you're securing the listing at 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, whatever it is you charge. But you're not a skilled agent, and so maybe you're a little lower than the rest of the guys. You are not going to turn around and offer a discount on your commission and then say, oh, by the way, let me talk to you about why you should offer more. No, you're not going to have that conversation with the seller who's already being tough on you.
Yeah, great point. Great point. All right, so and we can keep digging in on the listing side, but let's just switch to the buy side. I want to just show the audience what I was showing you. I got my hands on a couple of these buyer agency agreements that are already in place in other states. And I want to talk about then what happens on the buy side. Yeah. So for the audience sake, I'll just tee this up quickly. There's a buyer agency contract on screen. All right. We call it the exclusive right to buy. Now, you and I know we're in lockstep with this, in that you should list buyers the same way you list sellers. You should have a world-class buyer presentation, get a contract signed. That's the new world we're getting into. Most agents can't do that, Jeff. Yeah. So you and I are spending a lot of time educating, training, and coaching our agents on how to do that.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, except there's one exception to that rule, Brennan, and that is we still follow the ALM model, which is appointment first. And a lot of buyers are not going to say, sure, let me sign this contract to lock me into you, to go show a house. So we're going to introduce a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. And by the way, we've already had non-exclusive buyer agency agreements. Now that's just to show the house. Once we meet with the buyer and we have rapport with them, then we can switch to an exclusive, which, yes, to your point, is going to be, just like having a listing. But people are like, well, what's this idea of a non-exclusive? You've been doing them before. If you've ever written an offer or you ever did a one-party deal or you put the address of the property specifically, that's the same thing as a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. But that's going to be the quick way to get them signed, so you can still show the house and get into a relationship with somebody.
Yeah, 100%. And so there's going to be a lot of content coming out about that. Yep. And so, when we look at, okay, well, what's that?
Let's take a look at this, though. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw
it out. No worries. All good. And so, because the agents on the buy side say, okay, well, then how is it that I'm going to get compensated? And so this contract outlines 3 ways that can happen, right? And everybody knows this, but I don't want to talk about this. On the contract, it says the buyer's got to select one of these. Well, I'm going to ask the listing agent for some money. I'm going to ask the seller to pay my commission. Or if I can't get that, Mr. Buyer, you're going to pay me. That's one way. The other way is I'm not going to ask anybody for compensation. You're agreeing up front that you're going to compensate me. And I think I know where you stand on that. Or lastly, the agent can have the buyer sign a contract that says, I'm going to ask the listing brokerage for money. I'm going to ask the seller for compensation. But if I can't get either of those, you're not obligated to pay me anything. Now, I think that what you were saying before, which makes a ton of sense, is you're preparing yourself, your team, your clients to earn their own income. So speak to that and how you see that. Yeah.
So we are treating it as if every single buyer that we work with, we are not going to receive compensation from the seller or the listing brokerage. We are entering every single relationship with that understanding. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to ask for it. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be part of our offer. That doesn't mean if it's being offered in the MLS, we're not going to accept it. And that's, of course, going to help the buyer. But we are treating this as if every buyer who works with us moving forward fully understands that if we can't collect it, they are responsible for paying. And so therefore, we now have to revise our buyer presentation, our buyer process, so they fully understand that, before we get to writing offers. In other words, we are prepared. We are fully prepared to receive 0 if we have to.
Okay. So that's the one part I see a little bit different. And so here's what here's the way I'm looking at this. And again, nobody has a crystal ball.
We don't.
My belief is that if you had the ability to open up the MLS and see listing agent commission, like you can see the buy side commission right now, that's in our market standard 3%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever, you would see discounted commissions left and right. You'd see them taken at 1, 1.5, 3, 2 on the list side. Okay. You with me so far? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, on the list side, I believe a lot of agents are reducing their fees.
Right.
Yeah.
What I believe could be the new norm is that gets inverted. So what I mean by that is this. So when you take the listing, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, yes, all the things you've heard is true. You don't have to offer a buyer agent commission. However, what I think is very likely is that when buyer agent Bob submits an offer on your property, now we got him under contract at 3% commission on the list side, right?
Okay.
What is likely, Mr. Seller, is that when buyer agent Bob submits an offer, rather than the olden days where you were paying a lot of commission up front, that buyer agent's going to ask for some type of compensation for bringing their client to purchase your home. But here's the thing. We get to negotiate what it is that they get paid, unlike having to agree to it up front. And I believe what will happen is the commission compression happens on the buy side commission. In other words, if you were to look at list agent commissions now, they're all over the map, where buyer agents are that's what this whole lawsuit's about, right? Is the buy side fixed commission. That gets inverted. That listing agent commissions are pretty standard at 2.5%, 3.5%. Mm-hmm. And you see buy side commissions getting negotiated through offer negotiations at 1.5%, where the seller says, yeah, you know what? I like the offer. I'll give that guy a point. No problem.
Mhm.
And so tell me your thoughts on that.
So while we actually don't actually disagree on that, I'm just saying that I want to be prepared to receive zero. My only flaw in that I see is um, kind of goes back to it really depends on what market we're in because now watch this. If one of my agents who has their buyers fully understanding that they're going to pay whatever the fee is, 2.5%, 3%, to represent them on the buy side, we might have the conversation with our buyer in a competitive offer situation. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, it might be in your best interest to not accept the concessions that are being offered. It might be in your best interest to not ask for any concessions to go towards your closing costs, which include my compensation. So they're already of the mindset, well, we got to pay Jeff 3 no matter what. Now he did say he's going to, negotiate for us to try to get some of that covered, but in a competing offer situation, he's saying it could hurt the chances of our offer being accepted. We're going to take his word for it. We're going to go in at zero asking in concessions, and now our offer stands out amongst the competition. And so that's the only area where I think that scenario you would lose in that scenario because my buyers are going into it fully understanding that they're paying 3 no matter what, and if Jeff can get it, then that's gravy. Then that just helps reduce our costs versus having this understanding that, well, some will be covered, some will be your responsibility, and yeah, it might not be 3%, it might be lower than that. I'd rather just go into it with them understanding that they're paying 3 no matter what, and if Jeff sees an opportunity because we're not in a multiple offer situation to get some of that covered, then that's just bonus for us. That just reduces our overall costs.
And so, yeah, then the counter to that, and these are all, you and I are just having good conversation because no one has a crystal ball. We don't know what the new norms are going to be.
That's right.
The counter to that is you talked about the lack of skill on the listing side. Can you imagine a world where I don't believe that many agents will be able to command, you're going to pay me 3% to represent you on the buy side. I don't think that will be the norm, where agents have never done that in the history of this business yet. Mm-hmm. So when you're saying, so that's the only side, the only thing I see on that side where I'm not convinced that agents will be able to have buyer consultations and every time get a buyer to agree to pay 3% outside of the transaction. Yeah. And so therefore, on the listing side, going back to,
you're right, most won't. I mean, I'm thinking tough. Saying that now, this is just me being me.
Yeah.
I'm so competitive. I'm thinking to myself, mine will be
for sure.
We'll be prepared, but most won't. You're right. No difference on the list side. Most
that's
are not
right.
Prepared to convince or help the seller understand that it makes sense to offer out concessions still.
So, because we're talking about norms, we're taking the exceptions out of the equation, and we're looking at the norms, mm-hmm. And so. And the norm, going back to kind of how I think it could go, is if a seller has a listing agent at 3%, and you see buy side commissions getting negotiated on average, you're just talking about the norm, at 1.5, well, the seller still wins. And so that's the world where I think sellers are like, yeah, I used to just have to pay 5-6% up front. Mm-hmm. Now at the end of the day, I'm only paying 4.25%. Yeah. It makes sense. And buyer's agents, my belief, right or wrong, don't get mad, not you, the audience, don't get mad. I just think we're going to be in a world where buyer's agents are going to get what they get. It's like, I'm talking about the norm. I'm not talking about the elite. I'm not talking about the 20%. I'm talking about the 80%.
Yep.
And they're writing offers with an addendum that outlines their compensation for bringing the buyer. They write a nice, strong offer, and they're asking for 1.5% in commission.
Yeah. Which if they have the buyer understanding that their fee is 3, well then 1.5 to the buyer, 1.5 to the seller isn't that bad. It's just going to be really hard. I foresee buyer's agents struggling to get their offers accepted.
Yeah.
By in a competing offer situation.
How is it different? So on the seller side, that's true, but on this, like the way it is today, if a seller's paying 6%. Versus the new world where they're paying 4.5%. How would that be different?
Well, because for instance, you're going to have buyers that don't even want to mess with buyer's agents, and they're just going to go right to the listing agent. So what buyers don't have to, what buyers agents don't have to compete with as much right now, Brandon, you and I know this, only 1 out of every 10 listings gets double ended.
That's right. That's right.
15. So buyer's agents, don't really have to. Now we've had to, but not that often. That will change everything also because now all of a sudden buyers are going to say, I'm not going to work with a buyer's agent if I'm going to have to get stuck paying something. I'm just going to go right to the listing agent. So now buyer's agents are going to have to compete with the listing agent's deal with the seller to double end.
Yeah, so that'll be the last thing we talk about because I want to respect your time. So this is where you and I see it the same way too. So the question that I get all the time is, okay, if buyers are going to end up going to directly to the listing agent, we are not talking about dual agency. I'm talking about an unrepresented buyer. What happens? How does the listing agent get compensated? I agree with 100% what you said. On the listing contract, the new contract, there'll be in the additional remarks somewhere in that contract that says, yeah. Hey, if a buyer, if I go out there and get a buyer and I get them through the transaction, you'd end up be paying another point or a point and a half for me to help that buyer. Is that how you see that?
Yeah, that is exactly how I see it. Yep. So let's just say, I mean, I can tell you, I mean, I don't know where customary is going to end up, but I can tell you where we're probably going to end up is 3% on the list side and 1.5% if the buyer shows up unrepresented. So it ends up being
100%
commission to the seller, which if you look at that, okay, so let's just play that one out. If it's 4.5% to the seller and you got a buyer's agent showing up asking for 2 to 3% in concessions, all things being even, the seller's going to say, well, Jeff, let's just work with your buyer because this is going to save us a point or a point and a half commission. And nobody wants to talk about that, Brandon, but that's what's going to, you're going to, I mean, double ends. I think it could easily be 1 out of every 7 or 8 properties gets double ended under these new rules.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where we'll end.
Twice as many as well.
Absolutely agree. And this is why you and I are messaging to the industry. There's no better time right now than to work on your listing agent skill set, period.
Yep.
There's nothing else to talk about because if you can own the inventory, that things just get better for you as a result of this.
That's right. You get more buyers reaching out to you. You're collecting now 4.5 more often instead of 3 or 4.
That's right.
Or whatever it is. That's the way to go. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure obviously you've been doing this for a while. You're a great coach. I'm sure you're going to prepare your coaching clients for this as well. But we're creating a new buyer consultation. We'll be teaching it at our events this summer. I mean, we're don't get me wrong. We're not going to ignore the buyer side and just
for
say,
sure,
hey, everyone be listing agents. Now, I'm going to say I'm going to stick with being a listing agent because that's what I believe to be all along. But we still have an obligation for what you and I do to prepare agents on the buy side to be better, more buttoned up in their presentations. And that's certainly an area that we're going to be spending a lot of time on too, in addition to helping people become better listing agents.
Massively, because you and I, the work that we have to do is help our agents answer the question of, well, why should I pay you this money? What value do you bring? And most agents right now, if we're just saying, hey, let's be honest, they have a tough time answering the question, right? Why should I hire you? And so you and I are preparing agents on how do I answer that? How do I go into a meeting with a prospective client and deliver value in a tangible way where people sign a contract and agree to pay us?
I know this sounds like kind of airy-fairy or pie in the sky, but my belief is we're going to get to a point to where buyers are glad to pay us that fee because they're going to fully understand what it's going to do for them and what it means to them and their bottom line. It's no different than a conversation with the FSBO. You're the king of FSBOs. No different than a conversation with the FSBO. It's not about what you pay me. It's about what your net is at the end of the day. And the net is the house I'm going to secure you and how safe I'm going to get it to a closing table and how protected you're going to be through that process.
Price is what you pay. Value is what you get. That's it. So I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on, Brandon.